The night they found her, the mist hung low in the trees, thick enough to swallow sound, thin enough to let the moon carve ghostly shapes along the forest floor. She stood there barefoot, shivering, her hair tangled with leaves and dirt, staring at the deputies with eyes that never seemed to blink. At first, they thought she was injured. But then she smiled, slow, eerie, almost peaceful, and whispered, "He's coming for me. My brother, my Jesus." No one knew her name. No one had ever seen her in town. She looked like she'd stepped out of another century, thin as a willow branch, wrapped in an oversized sweater that hung off her shoulders like a stolen skin. When they asked where she lived, she pointed deeper into the woods, toward a place locals only spoke of in cautionary tones, where no mail was delivered, no roads were marked, and families who went in never seemed to come out right. She kept praying under her breath as they led her toward the patrol car, each word trembling with devotion. And every time the forest shifted or a branch snapped somewhere out of sight, she'd lift her head suddenly, as if expecting someone familiar to appear from the shadows. "He knows you're here," she said softly. "He knows you took me." On the drive back, she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and murmured strange passages about miracles, punishments, and a promise sealed in blood. She never referred to her brother by his name, only as Jesus, as though she genuinely believed divinity ran through his veins. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. None of them wanted to admit it, but something about her tone felt less like delusion and more like ritual. Learned. Repeated. Indoctrinated. Hours later, as she sat in a small room at the sheriff's station, rocking gently, whispering hymns that didn't exist in any church hymnal, a deputy noticed dirt caked under her fingernails, thick, dark, and fresh. As if she'd been clawing her way out of somewhere. Or away from someone. And just before dawn, when the building was silent and the world outside still asleep, she lifted her head, stared blankly at the camera, and said a single sentence that chilled everyone who later watched the recording. "He's coming for me when the sun goes down, and he's coming for all of you too." The moment the girl was discovered wandering the woods became the first crack in a mystery that the town had ignored for decades, a quiet disturbance that began with nothing more than the soft crunch of leaves under her bare feet. It was nearly dusk when two hunters spotted her, a thin silhouette drifting between the trees like a lost shadow. At first, they assumed she was injured or running from an accident, because no one walked alone in that part of the Appalachian forest, especially not at that hour. As they drew closer, they noticed the unnatural stillness in her posture, the way she held her arms close to her chest as though protecting something invisible, and the blankness in her eyes that made her seem disconnected from the world around her. She didn't scream or run when they approached. Instead, she blinked slowly, turning her head as though she were waking from a long, disorienting sleep. Her clothes were tattered, her skin pale beneath streaks of dirt, and her breathing shallow, as if each inhalation required careful thought. The hunters asked her name, where she had come from, if she was lost, but she only whispered something they couldn't understand at first, soft fragments of prayer, spoken in a trembling voice. It wasn't until she looked up fully, her eyes reflecting the dying light of the evening, that one of them realized she wasn't praying for herself. She was praying for someone else. "My brother will find me," she murmured. Her tone was calm, almost reverent, as though speaking about a sacred figure. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could ask more, she added in a breathy whisper that made their skin tighten, "His Jesus." The way she said it, serene, unwavering, left no room for doubt that she truly believed it. They tried to coax more information from her, but her responses drifted in and out of coherence, punctuated by moments where she stood completely still, listening to something only she could hear. The forest around them grew heavier with silence, and the hunters realized they couldn't leave her out there, not in that state. They wrapped her in a jacket and guided her toward the trail, though every few steps she would look back toward the darkening woods, as if expecting a figure to emerge. When she stumbled, they noticed deep scratches on her arms and legs, signs of someone who had been moving through the underbrush for hours, maybe days. Yet she never complained of pain. Her focus remained fixed on the trees behind them, her lips moving in whispered devotion, insisting softly that her brother always comes for her when the night grows quiet. When news spread that a strange girl had been found wandering the woods, the town's older residents reacted with a kind of grim recognition rather than surprise, as if a story they had tried to bury was slowly clawing its way back into daylight. People didn't speak openly about the family rumored to live deep within the forest, but everyone knew the whispers that drifted from generation to generation. They were the kind of stories parents shared in hushed tones to warn their children not to wander too far, the kind of tales dismissed in public yet preserved privately because something about them felt too unsettling to forget. According to these long-circulated rumors, a secluded family had lived miles from the nearest trail, hidden in a rotting cabin older than anyone could remember. They never came into town for supplies, never visited schools or churches, never made themselves known in any way that normal families did. Their isolation was so complete that many believed it was intentional, part of some tradition passed down by ancestors who rejected society long before anyone in the town was born. Locals spoke of seeing strange lights flickering through the trees at night, of hearing echoing chants carried by the wind, of shadows that moved with an unnatural rhythm around the old property. The few who dared venture close to the rumored homestead claimed the air felt heavier there, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Some insisted that the family was wrong in a way no one could fully explain, their voices too quiet, their movements too slow, their eyes too empty when caught from afar. Over the years, hunters reported glimpsing small children who vanished behind trees before a greeting could be spoken, their faces pale and startled like cornered animals. Rumors also circulated about inbreeding within the family, though no one could confirm it because no one had ever seen them up close. The town preferred to keep its distance, both out of fear and convenience, pretending the family did not exist so long as they stayed in the shadows of the woods. The discovery of the girl reignited all those buried fears. People exchanged theories in grocery aisles and on front porches, describing the legends of the family as though they had been waiting for a moment like this. Old memories resurfaced, stories of missing travelers, abandoned traps found neatly reset, and distant singing heard long after midnight. The more they talked, the clearer it became that the girl's emergence was not an isolated incident but a breach in a boundary no one had dared cross for decades. And beneath every whispered conversation lay the same quiet dread: if she had finally come out of the woods, then something inside those woods must have changed, and whatever had been watching them from the shadows might no longer be content to stay hidden. When the girl was finally brought into town and given a warm room, clean clothes, and water, the deputies expected the fog in her mind to lift. They hoped she would begin to speak like a frightened runaway, or at least like someone trying to make sense of her surroundings. But instead, her behavior grew stranger the more comfortable she became, as if safety only encouraged her to reveal the beliefs she had been forced to live with in the woods. When questioned gently about her family, she tilted her head with a serene certainty that made the hairs on the deputy's arms stand on end. She didn't describe them in normal terms, she didn't talk about parents, siblings, or a home. She only spoke about one person. Her brother. Her voice softened when saying his name, though she never actually used any name at all. The search for the girl's home began early the next morning, when a team of deputies and forest rangers ventured into the woods with nothing more than her vague gestures and trembling descriptions to guide them. The deeper they moved, the quieter the forest became, as if the wildlife itself refused to exist near whatever waited ahead. Hours passed before they noticed signs of human presence: broken branches arranged deliberately, small piles of stones stacked like markers, and scraps of old clothing tangled in brambles. None of it looked recent, yet all of it suggested a family that had lived out here for years without ever needing the world beyond the trees. The girl had spoken of a cabin, but the men expected something modest, maybe abandoned or half-collapsed. What they found was far worse. The structure appeared suddenly between the trees, looming like a wound in the landscape, its roof sagging under the weight of decades, its windows covered by blankets instead of glass. Every board seemed swollen with rot, every nail rusted, and the air around it carried a sour, heavy smell as though the forest had been trying and failing to swallow it whole. Approaching it felt wrong, like stepping onto ground that wasn't meant to be walked on. The cabin's door hung crooked, held by a single hinge, and creaked open with the slightest touch. The deputies expected filth or clutter, but what greeted them instead was something almost ritualistic. The walls were covered in drawings, hundreds of them made with charcoal, soot, and something darker they could not identify. Each sketch depicted the same figure, a young boy with blank eyes, standing beneath a halo crudely drawn in jagged strokes. In every image, he appeared larger than the others around him, towering like a prophet, often shown with hands extended toward kneeling figures whose faces were blurred or absent. The drawings grew more chaotic the deeper they moved into the cabin. Some had symbols carved directly into the wood beneath them, rough and violent as if gouged out in desperation. The floorboards were lined with melted candle stubs, forming paths to different corners of the single-room dwelling. One deputy found a small wooden box hidden behind a crate, filled with scraps of paper that appeared to be prayers or chants written phonetically, as though copied by someone who had never learned to spell. Every message praised the same boy, calling him savior, healer, chosen blood, the child of the second dawn. The most unsettling part wasn't the drawings themselves but how fresh many of them looked. The charcoal hadn't faded. The candle wax was newly hardened. Someone had been living here. Someone had been worshipped here. And despite the suffocating silence, the deputies couldn't shake the feeling that they were not the first ones to step inside that morning, and that whoever had created the shrine-like chaos might still be close enough to watch them from the shadows between the trees. One of the deputies found the journal by accident, tucked beneath a loose floorboard as though someone had hidden it in a moment of fear. It was small, bound in worn leather that had grown soft from years of handling, the edges frayed and darkened by dirt and fingerprints. The moment they opened it, a faint scent of mildew and smoke rose from the pages, along with something colder, an unmistakable sense that the words inside were never meant for anyone outside that cabin. The handwriting was messy, uneven, and childlike, but the entries were surprisingly detailed. It didn't take long for them to realize the journal belonged to the girl they had found wandering the woods. Her voice filled every page, trembling and honest, describing a life lived under rules, rituals, and beliefs so deeply ingrained that disobedience felt like a sin carved directly into her bones. Most entries began with prayers, not the usual kind taught in churches, but strange variations that praised her brother in ways no child should ever imagine praising a sibling. She described him as a being chosen by blood, born under a sign marked by their ancestors, a prophet whose purpose had been foretold long before she or her siblings existed. She wrote about how their parents taught them that the world outside the woods was corrupt, filled with liars and sinners who could never understand the purity of their family. According to the journal, they were forbidden from speaking to outsiders or stepping beyond certain trees marked with symbols only their family could interpret. Every rule centered around the brother, his protection, his purity, his destiny. The children were raised to believe that obedience to him was obedience to God. But within the prayers and praises, there were entries that hinted at fear. She wrote of nights when she heard him pacing in the attic above her, chanting in a voice that didn't sound like his own. She mentioned moments when he would stare at her for too long, his expression blank, as though he were listening to something behind her rather than to her. One entry described waking up with symbols drawn on her skin in charcoal, placed in patterns she didn't understand. Another spoke of a ritual he called the second birth, which he claimed would cleanse them of weakness and bind them to each other forever. She didn't explain what it meant, only that he told her she was chosen first. The later entries grew more frantic. Her handwriting became shaky, letters slanting off the lines as though written in haste or terror. She mentioned hearing footsteps outside the cabin at night, followed by her brother whispering to someone unseen. The forest, she wrote, felt alive, listening, watching. And then came the final pages, stained, smeared, and almost unreadable. They described her decision to run not because she no longer loved her brother, but because she finally feared what he believed he was becoming. The brother's room was the most unnerving discovery of all, a space that seemed to pulse with a quiet malevolence the moment the deputies pried open the warped, splintered door. Unlike the rest of the cabin, which had the chaotic disorder of ritualistic devotion, his room felt deliberate, controlled, and unnervingly precise, as if every object had been placed according to some incomprehensible code. The air was heavier here, thick with the smell of candle wax, incense, and something faintly metallic, like dried blood. The walls were lined with crude carvings, symbols and figures etched deeply into the wood that resembled nothing they had seen before, though some echoed the shapes from the girl's journal. There were circles within circles, jagged lines forming triangles, and strange humanoid figures whose faces were either blank or eerily identical to the boy himself. The carvings extended down to the floorboards, and one deputy noticed the floorboards themselves had been scorched in certain spots, forming patterns too intricate to be accidental. Each pattern seemed to lead to the center of the room, where a small altar of rough wood sat, blackened from repeated fires and covered in remnants of melted wax and soot. On top lay carved wooden figurines, each resembling a person in a gesture of submission, and in the middle, a larger figure that unmistakably represented the brother. Scattered around the altar were candle stubs, some melted nearly to the floor, others still partially intact, suggesting recent use. The deputies found scraps of paper covered in writing that was almost ceremonial in tone, phrases of worship, pleas for protection, and commands to some unseen entity. The handwriting was sharp and angular, different from the girl's softer script, and it seemed to carry an obsessive energy, as though written not by a child, but by someone convinced of a divine authority over all who entered the room. On the far side, a small chest contained odd trinkets, carved bones, feathers, and a handful of dried herbs, carefully bundled together. Each item appeared meticulously chosen, each placement deliberate, as though the brother were performing ongoing rituals whose purpose was hidden even from the girl he supposedly loved and protected. Most disturbing of all was a crude wooden cross mounted above the small bed in the corner. It was stained dark, not simply with age or neglect, but with something that suggested ritual use, something organic and undeniable. The deputies recoiled slightly, unsure whether it was symbolic, accidental, or something far darker. Shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the room, and for a moment, they felt as though the boy could appear at any second, stepping from behind a wall or under the low ceiling. Every object, every mark, every scent suggested that this space was not merely a bedroom, but a sanctuary of obsession, devotion, and fear, a place where the brother's authority was absolute and unquestionable, a room where the line between belief and horror had already been erased. The brother's disappearance came without warning, leaving the deputies and the girl in a state of creeping dread that seemed to stretch the very air around them. One morning, after a night of near sleepless vigilance in the cabin, the girl awoke to find the door to her brother's room ajar, the faint scent of incense still lingering but no sign of him inside. At first, they assumed he had gone to the woods for solitude, or perhaps had slipped past them in the night, but there was something about the emptiness of the room that felt deliberate, like a message rather than a simple absence. The altar remained, the carvings on the walls untouched, but the energy in the space had shifted. It no longer pulsed with oppressive presence, but hummed faintly, a quiet tension that suggested the brother had moved with purpose, unseen but fully aware. The girl grew frantic, murmuring prayers and shaking her head, her voice rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the growing panic in those who watched her. She insisted that he had left clues, that he would not vanish without leaving a trail for her to follow, and her eyes darted to every shadow in the cabin as though expecting him to materialize out of thin air. The deputies followed her guidance, carefully scanning the forest floor for any indication of where he might have gone. At first, there were only small signs, broken twigs, crushed leaves, footprints that were partially obscured by undergrowth and mud. Yet the trail grew more deliberate as they ventured deeper, and then came the carvings on the trees. Each mark was freshly etched, rough but intentional, forming a line that snaked through the underbrush. The shapes were unsettlingly familiar, echoing the symbols from the brother's room and the girl's journal, a secret language that only the family could understand. The markings seemed to pulse in the fading light, almost as if they were alive, guiding them toward a destination unknown. With every step, the girl whispered in half awe, half fear, interpreting the carvings as messages, warnings, and commands, insisting that the path would lead them to something sacred or terrifying, but never revealing which. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker, the air colder, heavier, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Strange sounds drifted in the distance, the snap of branches, a rustling in the undergrowth, but every time the deputies moved to investigate, there was nothing. Yet the carvings continued, leading deeper, winding tighter, forming patterns that disoriented even the most experienced trackers. By late afternoon, it became clear that the brother had orchestrated his disappearance, leaving behind a trail designed not to be followed easily, a path that would challenge anyone foolish enough to seek him. Every symbol, every footprint, every mark on the bark seemed to hint at intention, ritual, and obsession, and the forest around them no longer felt like a passive backdrop. It had become an extension of his will, a living maze in which the hunters, the girl, and even the deputies were unwitting participants in a story far larger and darker than they could yet understand. The girl's vision came suddenly, like a storm breaking over a calm landscape, leaving everyone who witnessed it shaken and disoriented. It began in the dim light of the cabin, just as the deputies were preparing to follow the trail of carvings her brother had left in the forest. She sank to her knees without warning, her fingers clawing at the wooden floor as though something beneath it was trying to pull her down. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and her lips moved in words that were barely audible at first, then grew louder, almost frantic, as if the air around her were vibrating with unseen energy. She spoke of seeing her brother bathed in light, standing atop a hill that did not exist in the nearby woods, his arms outstretched, eyes glowing with a strange, unnatural intensity. She insisted that he was calling her to join him, that he had prepared a place for her where the world's corruption could not reach, and that the second birth he had promised was imminent. Her voice shifted repeatedly between awe and terror, a tremulous cadence that made the deputies exchange uneasy glances, wondering whether she was speaking in riddles or speaking truths they were too unprepared to comprehend. As she continued, the girl described visions so vivid and precise it was as though she had walked through them herself, a procession of shadowed figures moving silently through the trees, reaching toward a radiant presence at the center. She claimed to hear whispers from her brother's lips, a language half remembered from childhood, half created in some internal devotion, telling her that she alone could complete the ritual of rebirth. The air around her seemed to thicken, carrying the weight of her fear and reverence, and even the deputies could feel it pressing against their lungs, a heavy tension that made movement difficult and conversation nearly impossible. At times, she would scream, then fall silent, murmuring in a voice that seemed not entirely her own, as if the forest itself or something within it was speaking through her. Her vision shifted abruptly, and she began describing a sequence of events that had not yet occurred, warning of danger and judgment should she fail to obey. She spoke of a light that would guide her brother through the woods, of a force that watched from beyond the tree line, and of a destiny that entwined her fate with his in ways she could not escape. The deputies tried to comfort her, to ground her in reality, but each word seemed only to intensify her trance. She pressed her forehead to the floor, muttering desperate pleas, claiming that she had to prepare, that he was already near, that the forest itself would part for his arrival. By the time the deputies realized the depth of what she was experiencing, it was clear that this was not simple hallucination or panic. Whatever she saw, whatever she believed, had the power to command her body and mind entirely, and they were powerless to stop it, caught instead as observers of a ritual whose full meaning might never be revealed. The investigation into the girl's family history revealed a lineage that seemed to exist outside the bounds of ordinary society, a pattern of isolation and obsession passed down through generations that was almost impossible to untangle. Official records were sparse and fragmented, births, marriages, and deaths were documented inconsistently, as if the family had intentionally avoided creating a paper trail. The information that did exist painted a disturbing picture: families living for decades within the same tract of forest, intermarrying, and cultivating a belief system that elevated their blood above all else. Each generation seemed to reinforce the idea that they were chosen, that divine purpose flowed through their veins, and that the children born of their line carried a sacred destiny that required absolute loyalty. The girl's parents, according to what little could be confirmed, had never attended school regularly, had avoided social interaction, and had instilled from birth the conviction that obedience to their eldest male child, her brother, was not merely a rule but a divine mandate. The girl's own journal corroborated much of this, revealing a childhood lived in near-complete seclusion, structured around rituals, prayers, and lessons designed to reinforce the supremacy of her brother and the purity of their bloodline. Neighbors from decades past remembered glimpses of the family but only from a distance, children playing in fields with a stiffness in their movements, adults walking with rigid postures, expressions blank and unreadable. Any interaction was fleeting, leaving behind only impressions of unease. Stories of the family's isolation grew more chilling when paired with local folklore of strange lights, chanting, and sudden disappearances near the forest's edge. Over time, these tales merged with reality, leaving a murky record of a family whose life existed in parallel to the world outside. It was not simply a story of neglect or odd behavior, it was a lineage carefully maintained to protect its secrecy and to perpetuate a belief system that justified acts society would condemn. Examining the genealogical threads revealed repeated patterns. Children born within the family were considered chosen, each male successor groomed to embody divinity, and each female raised to worship, obey, and eventually participate in rituals that bound the family closer together. Any deviation from this strict code was met with intense pressure, fear, or punishment, ensuring that generations maintained the same rigid hierarchy and devotion. The girl's insistence that her brother was Jesus was not a sudden delusion but the product of years of conditioning, indoctrination, and fear. It became painfully clear that her perceptions were shaped by a system designed to convince children that the divine resided in the flesh of one person in the family, that love, loyalty, and obedience were inseparable, and that the world outside was irrelevant or dangerous. Every revelation about her parents, their ancestors, and the ways in which they enforced this doctrine only deepened the sense of horror, highlighting the chilling reality that the girl's beliefs were not isolated aberrations but the natural consequence of generations of calculated, obsessive instruction. The final revelation came in the form of a hidden root cellar beneath the cabin, a narrow, damp space accessed through a trapdoor concealed beneath a rotting rug. The deputies had initially overlooked it, distracted by the altar, the carvings, and the girl's frantic state, but when one of them noticed a faint draft rising from the floorboards, curiosity forced them to investigate. The air inside the cellar was thick and oppressive, carrying a mixture of earth, mold, and a metallic tang that made the skin crawl. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they began to see the remnants of generations of secrecy meticulously preserved in the shadows. Old crates lined the walls, each one filled with objects that were both banal and horrifying. Jars containing preserved herbs alongside small bones carved into symbolic shapes, bundles of cloth stained dark with age, and scraps of paper inscribed with prayers and commands that seemed to address no deity in particular but rather a family bloodline. Among these artifacts were crude masks fashioned from animal skulls, some adorned with feathers and carvings that suggested ritualistic use, each one carefully placed to face the center of the cellar. It became immediately clear that this space was not a storage room but a sanctum, a place where the family's rituals were enacted, recorded, and guarded from the outside world. Deeper inside, they discovered what chilled them most, evidence that the girl's brother had conducted ceremonies meant to bind loyalty and devotion permanently. Charred remains of candles surrounded an area where small, carved figurines lay in submissive positions, and symbols etched into the floorboards matched those seen on the walls upstairs. There were signs of repeated use, fresh wax, slight indentations in the dirt, and recently scratched carvings that looked startlingly like human hands. The deputies realized that the girl's fear of the second birth was not simply the imagination of a frightened child but rooted in actual events carried out in this secretive chamber. Old photographs, yellowed and brittle, revealed generations of children posed around the altar, their faces solemn, their eyes vacant or eerily focused on a central figure whose resemblance to the brother was unmistakable. It was a revelation not only of ritual but of intent. The family had cultivated this system of belief, this hierarchy of worship, for decades, training each child to obey and revere one member as divine. The girl's conviction that her brother was Jesus was not accidental. It was a deliberate product of a lineage designed to reinforce obedience and fear. The cellar's contents hinted at a continuity of practice and obsession that extended far beyond the girl herself, suggesting that generations had lived, prayed, and perhaps died under the same doctrine. Every artifact, every symbol, and every trace of use underscored the terrifying scope of what had been hidden in the woods. The truth was undeniable. The girl's beliefs, her fears, her devotion, were not simply the result of isolation, they were the culmination of decades of planning, indoctrination, and ritual, a legacy that left the girl trapped in a reality where love, fear, and divinity had become indistinguishable.